Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the power of many, what next for PCNs. My name's Alison Oliver and I'm a lead partner for Hill Dickinson's National Primary Care team. I have to apologise because for some technical reason that when we haven't quite been able to get to the bottom of, my camera isn't working. It isn't that I'm having a bad hair day, although I am, but that isn't the reason that I have my camera off. It's for technical reasons, so apologies for that. I've been providing legal advice to GP practices for nearly 20 years, working on various commercial and regulatory matters, including partnership arrangements, practice structuring, mergers, disputes, and arrangements for at-scale working. I'm joined today by my colleague Helen Matthews, who's a senior associate in Hill Dickinson's primary care team, and she provides corporate and commercial support with me to primary care clients. And she supports PCNs with governance and incorporation of company vehicles in particular. We're delighted to be joined today by Sue Collis. Sue's a director of Athena Health Consultancy, has a background in nursing and NHS commissioning, and is a development advisor and quality improvement facilitator with NHS England's primary care transformation programme. And we're also joined by Shanaz Stansfield, again, for the second month running. Shanaz is a quality improvement manager and former managing partner at the award-winning Oxford Terrace and Rawling Road Medical Group in Gateshead. Shanaz is also a council member with the Practice Manager Association and a development advisor with NHSE's Primary Care Transformation Programme. So firstly, some housekeeping points. You will have had your microphones automatically muted and your cameras switched off. We ask that if you do have questions, if you could put them in the Ask a Question box or in the Q&A session at the end, you can raise your hand and we'll take you off mute so that you can ask those questions. The webinar is being recorded and we'll circulate the recording with a copy of the presentation slides after the event. We will ask you to provide some feedback. It's very important to us and we do read it and pay attention and try and use it to guide our future content. Webinars are bandwidth intensive, so we ask that you please close other browsers and programs and press F5 to refresh if you have any issues. And if you're just looking at this screen and can't hear me, then hopefully you'll read on here that you will make sure that your computer speakers are on or your headset and the volume is up so that you can hear the presenters. So in today's session, this is what we're going to be covering. We're going to start by talking a little bit about what we know about what's in store for PCNs in 2024 to 25. We're going to then talk about how you can create a shared purpose for your PCN. That will be Sue talking to that topic. Helen is then going to talk about PCN organisational structure and governance. And we are then going to hand over to Shanaz, who is going to lead the grand finale, how to make effective use of data and resources to improve services, and no doubt many other nuggets of fabulous, helpful information, as we always get from Shanaz. So firstly, what do we know about what's in store for PCNs in the next contract year? A little bit about the current landscape. What do we know? We know that PCN funding is having to work much harder to support practices' overall financial position and their bottom line. We're seeing more and more funding moving out of the core contract funding and into enhanced services and the network contract DES. We're seeing amongst PCNs a mixed bag of maturity. We're fortunate at Hill Dickinson that we work with PCNs all over the country, so we're able to see patterns. And the PCNs that we come across, there's quite a degree of divergence in how effective they are and what they're doing. Some are just sort of limping along and hoping for the best. Others are being very innovative and working very effectively together. We're seeing a lot of membership changes and either practices leaving PCNs and joining new PCNs, but also we're starting to see some PCN mergers. We're also seeing an increase in the number of PCNs that are forming limited companies in order to help support the work that they're doing and provide a legal structure for doing that work. And Helen's going to talk a little bit more about PCN company vehicles in her section. And finally, we're seeing a lot of PCNs getting involved in delivering non-DES activity. So as we know, the PCNs were formed initially to deliver the network contract DES back in 2019. And but since then, we've seen their role emerging. We're seeing some ICBs around the country commissioning local enhanced services from PCNs alongside the DES. We're also seeing, in some cases, ICBs awarding core contracts to PCNs. And we're also seeing PCNs looking for other opportunities to deliver services, such as private services, for example, or tendering for other kinds of NHS contract. In terms of this coming contract year, which is starting next week, of course, we still don't have the new DES specification, but we do have the letter that was published on, I think it was the 28th of February, from Amanda Doyle, about the new GP contract. And that had some information about the PCN DES for next year. So these are kind of some of the main things that we do know we can expect in the next DES specification. So we've been told that the investment and impact fund indicators are going to be streamlined from 5 to 2, with funding being redirected into the capacity and access payment, and no change as before, 70% of that to go to PCNs through the capacity and access support payment. We've been told that there is going to be more staffing flexibility for PCNs. In particular, PCNs can have one enhanced nurse or two if they have more than 100,000 patients, but otherwise the caps for advanced practitioners will be removed. We're also going to be see a simplification in the specifications. That's quite a mouthful to say, isn't it? A simplification of the specifications. So the enhanced access specification is going to continue pretty much as it was, we're told, but the other 8 specifications are going to be consolidated into one. Interestingly, we've also been told that the clinical director role is going to be simplified, and in particular, what we're told the clinical director role will be, it will involve service delivery coordination and coordination of the allocation of resources. And another key aspect of their role will be to support transformation and to support the PCN's role in developing integrated neighbourhood teams. And I believe Shalaz is going to talk a little bit more about that in her section. Also, quite significantly, I think the clinical director and leadership management payment is going to be directed into core PCN funding. So it will be interesting to see whether that has an impact and whether PCNs do still maintain that funding for its original purpose of supporting the clinical director role and management. As we know, PCNs need really good management to be able to fulfil their roles. So that's one to watch this space. So that's what we know in general terms. Of course, as we say, the devil is in the detail, and we still await the specification, and I think we can expect that early next month. I think mid-April is what we've been told. So on that note, I'm now going to hand over to Sue Collis, who's going to talk about how you can create a shared purpose for your PCN.
Thank you so much, Alison. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to share a short 3.5-minute YouTube video in a moment, but my section is going to share with you some tools and techniques that come from the evidence-based background of quality improvement and organisational development. So I hope you enjoy this next 3.5 minutes. It's quite light-hearted. Thank you. That's always brings a smile to my face when I watch that. Just to think that there is a choice that we could be calmer and more responsive in how we go about our work is always of interest to someone like myself. So what we'd like to do is to tap into that personal burning ambition. And part of that is to understand how shared purpose for you as a team is created and the value that shared purpose can bring to that experience and how it is also helping you to be more productive as well. So our shared purpose is often a set of words that are bounded about, but to truly understand them, you need to define who is our. Is that our as a practice? Is that our as a group of practices? Is our including our patients as well? Does it include those people who work with us but are in a different agency? Shared purpose stands for itself, understanding the overlaps of our values and our beliefs. And once you have this created, you can use it as a living reference point as you go forward with the work that you do. As Nietzsche said, it's about understanding why you get out of bed to do the work that you do. So the definition of purpose is a reason for which something is done or created for which something exists. All of this depends on people because change happens through people and with people. So understanding whether your team is engaged is really important. And there was a study done a few years ago by Gallup who found approximately 85% of employees globally were not engaged or actively chose to disengage, which led to poor performance for the team and also that sense of purpose was missing. So developing our shared purpose is essential for success. It's not a nice to have. And a lot of the more successful organizations in the world have this. Just a quick example, Nationwide, the bank has recently shared one, which is banking, but fairer, more rewarding, and for the good of society. Another PCN that I've worked with recently, their shared purpose was thinking differently, breaking barriers, improving lives. And they would use that as part of their references when they would be recruiting as well. So there's quite a few out there now that are using the shared purpose as the glue to help people to overcome some challenges. So when we're looking at shared purpose, it is bigger than the individual, it's the collective. And having those discussions helps us to understand where we differ and where we overlap. And it is an iterative process to create your shared purpose. Some of you may be aware that Simon Sinek, who you can also see on YouTube, has done quite a lot of work around shared purpose. And he talks about it from the point of view of why. Why do you do the work you do? So quite often organizations and teams know what they do, what service it is that they offer, or what product they create. Many understand how they achieve that service or how the process enables that product to be created. But very few organizations actually understand their purpose. What's their cause or their belief? It's not about making money. That's not a why. Revenues, profits, salaries, other monetary measurements are simply the result of what we do. We need to understand the why, and that's what inspires us. We would normally share more information about the limbic brain as well in how it connects to that part of our human approach to things, understanding how those middle two sections in our limbic brain helps us to understand the world around us. And the limbic brain is responsible for all of our feelings like trust and loyalty. It's responsible for human behavior, decision making, but it has no capacity for language. So in other words, when we communicate from the outside in, through people can understand vast amounts of complicated information like facts, benefits, figures, etc. It doesn't actually drive behavior or change it. So when we can communicate from the inside out, we're talking directly to that part of the brain that controls behavior and decision making. And people rationalize their decisions with the neocortex part of the brain. So what we are looking for here is to connect with the part of the brain that helps you to recognize the why. And when you have these discussions and have that sense of coherence as a team, you will find your levels of productivity are actually springboarded forward. So I wanted to just help you to understand that asking people to do things rarely brings us the benefits that we are hoping for. But if you engage in that process of enabling them to share about their values, what it is that drives them to do the work they do, and then collectively creating the words that can reflect that, this can be the glue that helps you to overcome some of the challenges that are constantly there for us all. And to enable people to have that opportunity to have that discussion, it often requires a degree of trust. And trust is really difficult. We understand how easy it is to lose trust and to gain trust. Charles Green kind of refers to it as an equation, a formula. He talks about it as trust is the addition of credibility, reliability, and intimacy. So the first three components increase your value of trustworthiness, while the fourth characteristic here, this self-orientation, refers to a much more personal focus. And if that can actually lower your degree of trustworthiness. Now, it's important to have a good ego, but you don't want it to be too overpowering because you would wish people to be able to follow you. Green talks about these components, credibility, as the words we speak in a sentence. We might say, for instance, I can trust what she says about intellectual property. She's very credible on the subject. If we're looking at reliability, he would say something like, this has to do with actions. We might say, if he says he'll deliver the product tomorrow, I trust him because he's dependable. And then intimacy refers more to the safety or the security that we may feel when we're entrusting a friend, a colleague, a family, a stranger with something. We might say, I can trust her with that information. She's never violated my confidentiality before, and she would never embarrass me. And looking to the fourth characteristic, the one he refers to as self-orientation, this is about the person's focus, and in particular, it's where the focus is on themselves or another person. Might say, I can't trust him or her on this deal. I don't think he cares enough about me. He's focused more on what he or she may get out of it. Or more commonly, I don't trust him. I think he's too concerned about how he's appearing, so he's not really paying attention. So trust is often talked about in the community that we work in general practice up and down the country. And I think it was last year, Ben Gowland put a reference out there about trust. And he said, without trust, practices will work to protect their individual autonomy, not give it up. So coming together to work as a network requires a significant amount of trust. Easily said. It's a challenge to achieve, sustain, and grow. One of the techniques we have used in the past is to look at trust based on the work of Himmelman, who talks about it as a continuum of 7 levels, and each of these build on the one before. And sometimes we find it really difficult to recognize where we are. So it's about having the conversation with the relevant colleagues who are impacted by our work in the team and other teams, because sometimes we have a blind side, to get that 360 understanding of ourselves, and that critical friend approach that helps us to understand what we may not be aware of, so we can recognize where we are, because this is a developmental technique here. It's not a performance thing at all. It's helping people to recognize that I thought we were at networking because we are a network, so surely we're there. We might have another colleague in the team to say, well, actually, looking deeper at the eligibility for each of these levels, where's the evidence to say we're doing X? And that's where we would have some of those conversations. When you see the word turf on here, it actually it can potentially invoke some antibodies actually for us in primary care. So I just wanted to make sure that you were aware that when we talk about it, it is about a positive intent, that as we move towards that building of trust, that sense of awareness of what are our resources, our risks, our responsibilities, is beginning to become more shared. So as you can see on this slide, it starts to lessen as an individual approach or frame, and it becomes more of a collective and emergent intent that it is shared, the resources, the risks, the responsibilities, etc., as that trust builds. This kind of leads into work that you also may be familiar with by Patrick Lencioni, and he talks about the achievement of teams, the behaviours of a high-performing team is actually based on trust. So that is his platform, that's his basis, that by building trust, all the other levels will help you to achieve that collective and individual goal that the team has set out as an aim for itself. But to build trust, it takes huge amount of courage to share that vulnerability within a team. And that can take time for it to become a approach that is consistently applied in how you work with one another. Once that is established, you will find that the ability to have a healthy conversation that is talking about a difference of opinions, that conflict, candid debate, rather than the artificial harmony that sometimes can occur. Building on that healthy conflict, you then have the option to have the collective accountability of each other within the team, so that you can call each other out, because the decisions that are being made, people are recognizing as, actually, I understand why you're saying that, but I don't agree with it. And it's about people having faith in what the golden sort of aim is at the time, to have a leap of faith and say, on this occasion, I will give you the benefit of the doubt, but I need you to recognize that I was not actually in favor of this initially. So by having that honest accountability with one another, or when actions have been shared and maybe they haven't been undertaken as originally hoped, there can be the honesty about what has happened, what new information is needed to be shared, so that everyone has the correct context. And ultimately, we find ourselves with a team that is able to have the honest conversations in a timely way, where they can share a difference of opinion, where the sense of accountability is more open, built on that frame of trust, and the team is achieving what they would like to achieve. So The flip side of that, and this is my final point before I hand over to Helen, is when that is absent, we find that the conflict often is more frequent. It may be obvious, but sometimes it can be hidden. You fail to have a regular sense of commitment to a shared aim. There's an avoidance to actually call colleagues to a conversation to have why has this gone a different way? What is it that we could do differently? And ultimately it fails to achieve the aim that you thought as a team you'd agreed was your priority. So I'm going to hand over to Helen now.
Thanks, Sue. That was really interesting. I would say I hope you enjoy this part of the session, but as this is the legal part, that might be wishful thinking, but hopefully you find it useful. So we've looked at kind of why, as PCNs, having a shared purpose is key to success, and Sue's covered some of the principles and behaviours of a successful team. I'm now going to talk you through the ways that you can structure the governance of your PCN in order to achieve your shared aim. So we'll start by looking at what PCNs are and what the default structure is, and how this can be improved in order to achieve your aims. So I think the key message here really is that the form your PCN takes has to follow the function. So once you've agreed on your shared purpose and your aims as a team, then consider how best to structure your network. So when we're considering how best to organise the governance of our PCN, it's worth reminding ourselves of the key features. So a very common misconception is that PCNs are themselves legal entities, when in reality, a PCN doesn't actually exist as its own entity. So the phrase primary care network is simply the name that's given to a group of practices who've come together to deliver the DES. And this is because the way in which the DES is contracted, so each individual practice is party to the network DES, and by being signed up to the DES, you've agreed to vary your existing core contract to include those DES obligations. So you've agreed to collaborate with other practices in your network to deliver the DES. You don't have a fixed governance structure, you're simply a group of practices who've agreed to deliver these services. So we'll often hear clients say our PCN has entered into a contract or our PCN employs the R's roles, when in reality, unless you've created your own sort of PCN entity, which we'll come on to, the reality is that one or more of your practices have agreed to enter into that contract or that employment contract on behalf of the other practices. So the key takeaway here is that the PCN is not its own entity, it's just a name given to your collaboration. And there are a couple of issues with the default PCN model. So there are two types of default models. You've got the flat, or also known as the shared model, on the left-hand side. And this is the model used by PCNs where one practice is unwilling to be the lead for the PCN. So you have staff who are employed across the PCN under joint contracts of employment. And you then have the lead practice model where one practice has agreed to be the lead and employ the staff on behalf of the other practices. And this lead tends to also be the nominated payee practice. From a liability perspective, neither model is particularly attractive. So ultimately, any liabilities for PCN are borne between the practices. And this is why one of the reasons why the network agreement is really key, as it sets out how liability is shared between the practices and in what proportion, and it's normally linked to list size. Most practices operate as either sole practitioners or through the partnership model, which brings with it this concept of unlimited liability. So if a practice's assets aren't enough to cover its share of the PCN liability, then it's the individual partners who can be liable. And partners also have this concept of joint and several liability, which means a creditor who's owed a payment from a practice doesn't need to ask each of the partners to share in that liability equally. They can seek the amount from anyone in the partnership. So they might go after the partner who they perceive as having the most assets. So from a liability perspective, neither model is particularly attractive. From a workforce perspective, particularly with the shared or the flat model, it can be confusing as to which practice is responsible for admin and HR. And the lead model does alleviate some of these issues, but the downside is that there is a greater risk for the lead practice. So they have to put their hand up to be the lead. And as the employer of the network staff, claims would be brought against that lead practice. That practice would then need to look at the network agreement and enforce the necessary provisions against the other practices. Another common area of concern for PCNs is VAT, so whether the structure that's been adopted gives rise to a supply between the practices which would attract VAT. And it's an area which we would always say you need to discuss with your accountants, but essentially under the flat model or the lead practice model, if you have one practice employing staff and the staff are required to work across the remaining practices, the issue is that that might be seen as a supply of staff and then attract VAT. Surplus is the other kind of potential issue. So if the PCN is creating a surplus, which is becoming kind of more and more common, the larger PCNs grow, each practice owns a share of any surplus in that PCN pot. And then that surplus is taxed as practice profit. So even though that surplus might be held by a nominated payee practice, each practice should still be providing for its share in the partnership accounts. So in summary, neither of the default models is ideal from a liability and taxation perspective, and these issues are becoming more of an issue for PCNs as the businesses grow. Because of these issues, more and more PCNs are looking at improving or adapting their organisational structure so they can keep achieving their purposes and their aims whilst mitigating the risks that are associated with these models. As a primary care network, whichever model you're operating within, whether that's the shared or lead model or through a separate entity, which we'll come on to, it's vital that you have a clear governance framework in place to document how you operate and the principles that you will abide by. So just to kind of recap on why you need your network agreement, really, I suppose the key purpose is that it puts your relationships on a formal footing. So as Sue was talking about, a lack of accountability and trust can be detrimental to the way that your PCN operates. So it's important to be able to document those agreed principles, your ways of working, and each practice's obligations within a legally binding agreement. So everyone's on the same page. In addition to kind of principles and ways of working and decision making, one of the key points we'd expect your network agreement to cover is around sort of risk and liability provisions, particularly around the employment of staff. So if you have a lead practice who is employing staff on behalf of the wider network, the lead practice needs to ensure that the network agreement explains that all practices are required to contribute towards any employment claim, and that lead practice shouldn't be out of pocket for taking on that role. And without these provisions, the lead practice as an employer is potentially responsible for all employment liabilities. Similarly, the network agreement needs to document how the nominated payee manages the DES funding on behalf of your PCN, so those accounting principles, what you'll do in the event of the PCN generating a surplus or if it finds itself with a deficit, and if any VAT does arise on the supply of staff, how that would be dealt with. So I think if you take from this part of the session, it would be to ensure that you have a clearly documented network agreement which documents how your PCN operates. As PCNs grow, so do their liabilities, particularly relating to the employment of the R's staff, which means we're seeing more and more PCNs look at forming companies as a vehicle for employing staff and managing that risk. So as the functions of the PCN grow, you then need to look at your form and whether this is still right for you as a network. So we're going to quickly look at what a company is, how it can support you as a PCN, and how you go about creating a company. And the process of creating a limited company is typically described as incorporation. So incorporation means the process of forming an entity which has a separate legal personality. So the company is an organisation which exists in its own right, which sits separately from its members. And when PCNs talk about incorporation, what we're not doing is converting the structure that you currently have, whereby you have several practices who've come together to deliver the DES. And this is probably one of the main points to note when thinking about incorporation. Your existing PCN structure will remain in place, but by incorporating, you're creating a separate company which sits alongside the PCN. The company would be owned by its members or its shareholders, who are the core practices. Core practices are normally partnerships. A partnership isn't legally capable of holding shares or membership in a company, so each practice would nominate a GP to hold that share on behalf of their practice. Key point here is that because the company is a separate legal entity, the company itself can do business, it can enter into contracts, it can hold property, it can sue and be sued under a contract. So the limited company itself can employ staff under an employment contract rather than an individual practice having to employ the staff. So the company is a separate legal person. And if the company was facing an employment claim or any other claim, the most the claimant can recover are the assets of the company, but they can't claim from individual members. So the most that a shareholding practice could be required to contribute to a claim against the company would be any amount that's unpaid on their shares. So each practice would be allotted shares in the company up to £1 or pennies, so very nominal amounts. So this model is really all about protecting individual partners from being exposed financially. This slide sets out how your PCN structure might evolve over time and how the limited company can support the network. So as we've said, your purpose and your form should dictate your structure. So if you're thinking about creating a limited company, the first thing you need to think about and agree on as a network is what's the purpose of the company? What will it do? This slide sort of sets out the sliding scale of options. So on the left-hand side, you've got your default PCN structure, where your key document is, as we've said, the network agreement. And you need to document within your agreement how you operate, how services are delivered, and how staff are employed. And if your PCN decides to create a limited company, typically the company may start by providing that kind of non-clinical back office employment support. And if the company is just providing that kind of support, then you need your employment contracts in place. You need to consider the employment business regulations. So these are regulations that apply to companies that just employ staff and then transfer that staff, the staff elsewhere, so into practices, which aren't particularly onerous, but it's just something to bear in mind. And then over time, you might then subcontract certain clinical services to the company. So passing on the responsibility for delivering the clinical services to the company, which then triggers your CQC registration and need for commissioner consent. So what you decide dictates the documents that are needed. And you'll see from the table that where we're asking the company to do something for the practices, we need to document this within a subcontract. So under that subcontract, the core practices are saying that they're the contractors of the DES and they're passing responsibility for certain aspects to the company. So key takeaway, before you make any changes to the way that your PCN operates, you need to have first decided what you want your PCN to be doing, what you want the company to do, and what's your purpose. And then that will dictate the documents that are needed and how you should be structured. Before I hand over to Shanaz, I want to just very quickly run through the steps for setting up a company so you can understand how a PCN might move to this model. So as we've said a couple of times, you have to first decide what the company is going to do and appreciate that this will probably evolve over time as the PCN grows more comfortable with the model. When you've decided what you want the company to do, creating the company at Companies House is fairly straightforward. It involves applying to Companies House to register the company, and you need a name which has to be unique and include the word limited, and a registered office and at least one shareholder for the time being. Once the company's formed, you can then start to work on your governance arrangements, which could be an entire webinar topic in itself. But in summary, you need to start thinking about the governance arrangements for the company, and we would develop bespoke articles of association, which is the rule book of the company. And you'd need to update the network agreement schedules as well to reflect that you have a company and that it's part of the PCN structure. The next stage would be to prepare for the company taking on the functions of the PCN. So we've run through these points sort of previously, but you would need to have the legal documents in place. So your subcontract between the practices and the company, your revised network schedules, and also potentially a transfer agreement to set out the terms of the company taking over sort of assets and staff if it's going to start employing the staff. And if you currently have any third-party providers who are delivering services that you want the company to take over, for example, if you have a federation that's currently providing those services, you'd have to review those contracts and arrangements and start the process of terminating them. And you'd also need to obtain consent from the ICB to the subcontracting arrangements. If the company is going to be employing staff, you've got to apply for your pensions access, either as an independent provider or get a special direction. And if staff are transferring across to the company, TUPE would almost certainly apply. So that would protect the continuity of the employment of the IRS staff and their terms and conditions. And there's certain things you'd need to do to comply with TUPE, including sort of consulting on staff. Other key points, so you need to apply for CQC registration if the company is delivering clinical activities. Company would need its own bank account and its accountants. And you need to make sure that the company has sort of other registrations and insurances as well, so that it can perform those functions. Once you've got all the necessary arrangements in place, the company can then start delivering the services for you. There are kind of ongoing considerations, so the company would need to comply with its obligations to file certain information at Companies House on an annual basis, and kind of when specific events arise, such as creating new shares or director changes. Just to summarise before I hand over to Shanaz, it's really important that you agree what you want your PCN to do. Look at your governance framework and think, is this still working for us? Can this be improved or tightened within our network agreement? And would we potentially benefit from creating a company to support our PCN? So I'm now going to hand over to Shanaz, who'll be able to help you with some of the more practical considerations, but I hope you found that useful. Oh, you're on mute, Shanaz.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Helen. That's been really interesting. I'm delighted to be here with you today and looking at the participants list today, that we've got lots of friends who are on the call today, so welcome everybody who's joined us. My background is in nursing and health commissioning, and I spent the best 16 years of my career being a managing partner in a GP practice. But I was also director of transformation for our PCN from the inception of PCNs. So we job shared, myself and the CD job shared the role. And I'm hoping that what I'll be able to do is actually share some of those examples and experiences that will help you give you some food for thought, really, in terms of how we progress as this journey for PCNs also starting to progress. I retired from the practice last June, but within 2 weeks they rang me up and said, Shanaz, we've got a little project we would like you to do. And within 2 weeks I was back in the practice as a quality improvement lead. And the reason I went back to quality improvement in the practice is because I feel so passionate about quality improvement, but also the opportunities that quality improvement brings to practices, you know, in the new QI indicators around staff well-being, the demand and capacity indicators, and many of the IIF indicators. We can wrap those around population health need, and I'll share some of that with you today. So, thinking about your PCN. I work in a practice, and increasingly over the years, working in practice has actually become really, really frustrating, because on our own we can't really do very much, can we now? Because more resources are going towards PCN, and actually what we're finding is working with our PCN practices gives us more strength, but also gives us more influence. And what that's about is it's about leadership and followership within the PCN. So we've rehearsed already the changing role of the CD. And the CD role is becoming very much an orchestrator, you know, somebody who actually who's working with a range of organisations, orchestrating the development of services, looking at access, and now starting to think about what INTs might look like. And if you think about what your CD has been doing for the past 4 years, isn't that some of the stuff that they've already been doing, working with the system around health inequalities, working with patients and having different conversations with patients, thinking about how we actually address that personalised care planning component that's all been part of the PCN and services. And if you think about, you know, some of these colourful doors, what that really means to me is during COVID, when we were going through our lowest ebb as patients and as organisations, we opened our doors and lots of other organisations opened their doors to help us. So what we found was actually there was an opportunity to work with that diversity of skill and knowledge and diversity within our communities to help us to actually start to address some of the most challenging things that were happening to us. And what I find is I'm constantly still knocking on those doors, and actually I keep my door open so people can work with me and that we can work together to start thinking about that collaborative continuum that Sue talked about. And if you look at this picture of the red arrows, what that represents to me is about thinking about seamless leadership and followership. You know, every one of the red arrows, when the Great North Run is on, they fly over the top of my house and I see those beautiful colours. Every person flying one of those planes knows what they're about, they know what their responsibilities are, but they work together as a team to create those beautiful patterns in the sky. And actually some of those are things that we can do as PCNs. And looking here, you know, in terms of the models and the needs of our population, in my practice, almost every other person who comes to the practice now is a young person with a mental health problem. It's a person waiting for an ADHD assessment who's having to wait 2 years for an assessment. How do we start to manage some of that? And actually thinking about that leadership and followership in our PCN is really important. And that really connects in with the modern general practice model. So many of you will have seen this when you were developing your CAP plans, and some people thought this was about digital access, and actually it's not about digital access. It's about better alignment of your capacity and thinking about improving the working environment for your staff, but also improving the patient experience. So no matter how your patients contact the surgery, whether it's by telephone, online, or whether they walk in, that your receptionists are well skilled and have actually been trained to be able to use all the new digital tools, and they've actually got the skills to do their job better because during COVID things changed. So this model is about thinking about those patient needs, thinking about the population needs, and thinking about how we actually design our access model about patient need. And the CD's role is actually changing to start thinking about some of these things. How have we done that in our PCN? So governance has been really, really important for us. And one of the things that we realised, actually, the CD doesn't have to do it all. From the outset, our practices have been very, very connected with the PCN. So Teresa Graham, who's actually one of the practice managers, came from a mental health background. She became the health equalities lead in the PCN. So she actually now is leading our INT development in our PCN. She has the skills, and what we've done is actually the funding that was available has gone into the practice to backfill Teresa to free her to actually do this work. She's now working with the system around that integrated neighbourhood working, but also connecting in with all the third sector organisations what we work with. Anna Graham, her background was in social services commissioning, so she is the lead practice. And this model that we have at the moment works really well for us. And the reason it works really well for us is actually we've used that Lencioni model and we've thought about trust, and we've actually developed an infrastructure that enables practices to be connected to the PCN rather than be separate from it. So we do things together rather than do things separately. Anna is the lead practice. She holds the contract, but also she employs the staff for the PCN. But we've also done lots of work on demand and capacity. So in our PCN, some ARR staff work in individual practices, some work across 2 practices, and some work across 3 practices. But no matter which practice they work in, or the number of practices that they work in, they feel safe because we've got mentorship, we've got clear job descriptions, we've got really, really robust HR processes, but also that staff in the practices and staff in the PCN actually all value the Agenda for Change terms and conditions. I was Director of Transformation in the PCN, but I'm actually now back doing operational work, working across the PCN, but also in the practices to think about how we align to those quality improvement tools. And it's actually the staff in the practices that are involved in the PCN in making sure that we achieve the IIF, but also looking at the demand and capacity indicator, but the staff wellbeing indicator. So everything is actually equally spread across the practices, and we're all actually engaged in actively working with the requirements of the PCN. And I think when Sue shared that collaborative continuum, you know, there were 7 levels there. And just by calling yourself a collaboration, or just by calling yourself integrated, doesn't mean that happens by osmosis. You have to working up through those levels, and actually that's about developing trust. And what we've done is our PCN is we share resources, we share responsibilities, we absolutely share the risks, and we share the rewards. And we've had to work really closely with our legal team, but also with our accountants to make sure that our practice schedules are up to date, that we've got the agreements up to date, and that every time the PCN changes, those agreements are renewed and everybody who works in the PCN are connected to it and actually aligned to it. But that means not only the people who come to the PCN meetings, it means all the partners in the practices, but also we have a mechanism within the practices that we actually, anything that we discuss at the PCN meetings is actually cascaded into the practices, so the practices feel as though they're part of the PCN rather than something separate, that PCNs are doing things to them. And that's been really important for us from the outset. And some of that is important because as we start to think towards moving towards integration, what I find is actually we're data rich, but we're information poor. So we have so much data coming to us from so many different places. I work with digital and transformation leads, and they're often really, really disempowered and feel as though they're down a rabbit hutch really with the amount of data that they've got. And how do they make sense of the data to make sure that practices are connected and the data means something to practices? So thinking about the data, understanding your baseline, really understanding what problems you're trying to solve. And there are so many platforms out there that we can actually get the data from now. Otherwise, you know, we run the risk of being carried away by that waterfall you can see there and drowning under all the data that we've got. And certainly, you know, from our PCN, it's something that we talk about all the time. Sue also talked about our shared purpose, and our shared purpose is really important to us. So as a PCN, we came together as 3 practices and agreed what our shared purpose was going to be. We had a separate vision, but our shared purpose is about, you know, why do we get out of bed in the morning to come and do this job? What is it that's going to align us? What is it that we're going to work together on that's going to be that burning ambition for us? And we started with data. We started to collect data on demand and capacity. So in my practice, we've been collecting data on demand and capacity for 15 years. So for me to see the demand and capacity indicator eventually in the contract is fabulous, because unless you know what demand is, how do you know what services you need? So understanding demand and capacity, and as part of your PCN contract, as part of the QOF, you've have had 2 conversations with your PCN about some of the indicators and actually what needs do you identify, what improvement plans we're going to put in place, and actually how we're going to put those improvement plans in place. And that builds on to actually understanding what your demand is made up of. And once you start to understand what your demand is made up of, you start to think about population health. And we have the joint strategic needs assessment that's available to every PCN through the local authority. So connecting in with your PCN and your local authority to identify what the needs are within your practice population, within your PCN population, will start to give you some thought to actually, if we're going to be integrated, what we're going to be integrated around, and actually how does that work? So we work very closely with Becky Mulby at London South Bank University, and there's a huge amount of evidence around, you know, how MDTs and integration might work. And there are areas that practices can work together, and there are areas that PCNs can work together. And some examples from my practice in PCN of how we're working together on thinking about integrated working. So when you see this, this first step, which is about volunteers, so in our IIF, we needed to identify a community that we were going to work with, a vulnerable community. So we decided that what we would work on was actually food poverty. And what we did as a result was actually set up a food network. And we've always worked with food banks. We've set up warm hubs. We've got 2 allotments that we're connected to do. We do lots and lots of work around food poverty. But what we needed to do was actually connect in with the community. So we set up this food network. So we've got a bee artist involved. We've got somebody from the Jewish community. We've got refugees and asylum seekers. We've got the Comfrey Project. We've got statutory organisations coming together around food and food poverty. Now, the Jewish lady that's involved in this network has just been gifted an allotment, and she doesn't know what to do with this allotment. So we've already got 2 allotments, and we're going to help her with her allotment. And the care coordinator in our practice, who's actually helped to set up some of the allotments, is going to help her. But what she wants to do is that there are many Jewish young women in the community who've actually got learning disabilities or physical disabilities. And what she tells us is that these women will not be able to marry, but what she wants them to be is actually self-reliant. And what we're going to do is actually use that network to bring services into that community, work with those women to actually make them, empower them to be self-reliant, to be able to grow their own food, to be able to cook their own food, but also connecting with other services. The other thing that we're doing as part of this network is working with refugees and asylum seekers. So our PACN is connected to one of these hotels, living in a hotel in a single room with a family. Food poverty, nowhere to be able to put your food, nowhere to be able to cook your food, not having the money to buy your food. It's these people that keep coming to the practice over and over again. And when we don't have medical interventions for those people, and we certainly can't do anything for them in a 10-minute appointment. So we've got the refugees and asylum seekers working with us on the food network. So we provide them opportunities to actually to be able to grow their own food in an allotment, to be able to cook their own food because we've provided a kitchen, but also we're teaching them how to actually preserve their food, how to do dehydration, how to make jams and chutneys. And actually by bringing people together, they're starting to become self-sufficient, but also what we're doing is making sure that they're eating real food. They're not eating fried chicken, which is what, every shop around my practice is actually a fried chicken shop. And what we're doing is actually preventing people going to those shops. What we're doing is actually help them to be self-reliant around food. But we're working with other organisations to stop food waste so that actually this food can be available to everybody who needs it. In terms of moving up the next step, social prescribing link worker and working with others, people with 2 or more long-term conditions have a year of care plan. So we actually start to think about people, about what's important to them rather than what clinical condition they've started to come in with. We have PCN-wide MDTs. So our CD actually leads the frailty MDTs within our PCN. The community nurses come along to it, and other people who are connected to that patient and working with that patient come along to it. We also then work at a system level, and acute services providers work with us around more complex people with care planning for care homes. And then the last MDT that we do is actually with consultants who come out from community to work with us, our community services and others. So you can see once you start to actually gather data to understand population health need, what you find is actually people need intervention at different levels. And as your CD role matures, as your PCN starts to think about, actually, we can really take control of this. But these are the things that we need health practices to do. And this is what we can do as a PCN. And this is support that we need from our system. It's actually that type of stuff that will put you into control. And thinking about our ARR roles and workforce redesign, there is lots of challenges at the moment about ARR roles. And if you look at any social media, there is just so much upset around this. But I see the ARR roles as actually the cavalry. Things have become so complex for patients. We've seen increasing demand through failure demand, really patients being bounced about the system. So when you start thinking about workforce redesign, you start with that demand and capacity piece that you've actually done in the practices this year. Then you start thinking about why do we need this role? What data do you have that tells us actually why we need this role? And then you start thinking about which population it'll serve. Where will the staff come from? How will we support the staff? When we developed a frailty nurse post in the practice, and I think she's still the only one employed through the practice doing what she does using comprehensive geriatric assessment, we had to develop mentoring mechanisms for her through community services, so she wasn't separated from her peers who were working in other services. Looking ahead in terms of what their development needs might be, thinking about their education and training. When people come into a role, within 6 months they'll be doing one thing, but actually as they become more confident, they build up more skills, their role will change, and we're constantly redesigning the roles, and measurement is key to that. And thinking about, so I'm just going to leave you with a patient story. So Joyce is a lady in my practice, and some of you might have heard Joyce's story. Joyce is a lady who was being looked after by her son, and our advanced nurse practitioner went to Joyce's house and found that Joyce was living in a conservatory. Joyce's slippers were broken, the lead on her electrifier was frayed, and actually she wasn't being fed during the day or watered, so she was at high risk of hospital admission and UTIs. Karen gave her the injection, but then rang Jane and Julie, who were the social prescribing link workers in the practice. They went and did an assessment and rang social services. Within 2 hours, social services were there, and they did an assessment. And while they were there, they actually organised some respite care for Joyce. We spoke to the son, and the son said, well, my mum told me everything was fine, she didn't need anything during the day, but this woman was demented. So we organised Meals on Wheels for her. a practice-based occupational therapy came out on the same day and sorted out the fire and sorted out the slippers. And actually what we did was actually we have different mechanisms for care planning. So we have the year of care plan for people with 2 or more long-term conditions. We have comprehensive geriatric assessments, which are care plans, and we have the emergency healthcare plans and end-of-life care plans. So we use all those different care plans for that multidisciplinary team working. And by developing that care plan, we were able to actually organise food and drink for Joyce during the day. We were able to organise respite for her. We were actually able to organise a holiday for the son, and actually some support for her from social services. And we did that in 8 hours on a Friday. And when I start thinking about starting with data, when I start thinking about what integrated care looks like, that's what good care looks like for me. And that's what I would want every patient in my practice to have, no matter what their age is. And actually, we have in our PCNs the opportunity to be able to do that. And I suppose the thing for me is, as a manager working in general practice, the biggest challenges have brought me the most joy, because what I've done is I've opened my doors and people have come in and people have held my hand and people have helped me to really climb up the hardest hills. And by working together, we've actually developed wonderful relationships. And I think holding each other's hands, supporting each other through this challenge is actually one way of actually being enjoyed both to your PCN and also your practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shanaz. That was brilliant. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to all our speakers.